Hello and welcome back. Here is another example for VAT cases in German law. And let's first, as always, think what happens. So, M from Mannheim is the proud owner of a machine factory in Mannheim. And now M has some technological problems, and for this reason, she invites the foreign expert FE from France to help her solve her problems. FE arrives at Mannheim, spends 3 days there, solves the problem, and then goes home again. He charges the following amounts to M: 25 working hours to 5,000 euro, costs for a hotel stay for 3 days together 1,000 euro, travel costs 500, so in total a net amount of 6,500, and then VAT on top, and this leads to an amount payable of 7,735. And M is highly grateful for the quick help, so she pays this invoice immediately without any hesitation. And so our question has to be, how do we solve this case and what happens and is important here? The first thing is, and I think you will have understood that in the meantime, is again to make sure with a small sketch that we see who is doing what for something for whom. So who has contract with whom? We have M from Mannheim, but she is the customer. So we have FE, an expert from France, and FE does something for M from Mannheim, which is in Germany. Okay, so this way it looks a bit nicer in a second. Okay. And what is done is simply giving it wise and charged as an amount of 77335 and paid. So this is what happens here, and what we now have to do is simply solve the case. So where is here now the beginning? Let's have a look. Let's talk first about taxability. To test is paragraph 1.1, number 1 of the Umsatzsteuergesetz, and FE is an entrepreneur to 1 sentence 1 and 3 because gives advice for money that is aims at revenue, is independent and active on a sustainable or constant basis, acts within his enterprise. Yes, paragraph 2.1 sentence 2 says so. It's even his main activity. Does he act for consideration? Yes. Demands a price. No problem. Now let's come to the really interesting things. That is it a delivery or service? And we find out this is a service. Yes, paragraph 3.9, because no transfer of ownership in a tangible good. Giving advice is just intangible. Now the question is, does it happen in the inlet? Now you would say the guy comes to the inlet and gets active here, but that's not decisive. So for finding out if it happened in the inlet or not, we do not need to look to geography, but to the place of the service. And you know, there are rules in paragraph 3a USTG. And there are two basic rules. One, if the customer is a business person, the other one, if the customer is a private person. Here we need the rule for customer is a business person, machine factory. And this rule is the place where the service is attributed to is where the customer has established a business here. That is Mannheim, that's Germany. Paragraph 3a USDG has to be tested if that changes something, and we have to have a look through that paragraph in order to find out if there is a deviating special rule. And here they are, the special rules of 3a3. Number 1 says if there is a service in connection with immovable property, then the location is where the immovable property is situated. Well, repairing machines or inspecting machines is nothing of that kind, so that's not the case. Next rule. The short-time lease of a means of transportation, no, we don't need that. A lease of a means of transportation which is not short-time, no, there's no vehicle in place here. Cultural, artistic, scientific, educational, athletic, entertaining, or similar events. If the recipient of the service is neither an entrepreneur nor having VAT identification number, well, giving advice on technological matters is nothing of that kind. The delivery of food and drink for immediate consumption on the spot, gastronomy or restaurant services, no catering services, no. Work on movable, tangible property. Well, machines and inspecting them might qualify here, but this special rule only applies if there is a customer who is neither an entrepreneur nor nor has VAT identification number. And that's the reason why we don't need to get busy with that special rule here. Acting as an intermediary, brokering, agency, service, etc. No. The supply of the right for entrance to cultural, artistic, scientific, educational, and so on event if the customer has a VAT identification number or has the status of an entrepreneur. No, nothing of that kind. The following paragraphs 3a4 to 3a8 are usually only relevant if some element of the case has to do with the third countries. That's not the case here. Our advisor comes from France. The machine problem is in Mannheim. The customer is resident in Mannheim. So 3a4 to 8 do not need to be looked through here. So we can end our journey through the paragraphs here and go back to the case. So let us make the necessary remark. 3a3 does not change this. 3a4 to 8 do also not apply. So we have a transaction which is taxable in Germany. Number 2, do we have a tax exemption? And the answer is probably a clear no. Look through paragraph 4, it does not apply. So the transaction is liable to tax. Then we need the tax rate, the tax base, and that must be the net amount, third of 10, 1, sentence 1 and 2. That's all what FE receives. That's 7,735 euro minus the VAT amount included therein. Let's make a question mark here, and that leads us to a net amount, which is also until later a question mark. For the tax rate and tax amount, 12.1 says it's 19%. That seems to be correct because paragraph 12.2 does not apply here. So we have 19% on something which we do not yet know because we had it made a question mark here. Formalities. The taxpayer Well, that's usually the entrepreneur, so that would be FE. But now we have a special problem with that entrepreneur. FE is resident in France, so he's not really within the convenient reach of the German fiscal administration. And you remember probably there was a special rule, reverse charge rule under paragraph 13b, which says in certain cases, the fiscal administration and the law here prefers to declare the customer the taxpayer if that is more convenient for all persons involved, or if one can assume this. It's not an option, it's compulsory. So let's test paragraph 13b, because the entrepreneur is a foreigner. That is very often an indicator for there might be paragraph 13b in play. So let's have a look to that paragraph. And perhaps you remember when paragraph 13b is in play, we have to look for two things. First, if the transaction which is here is on the list of transactions for which 13b can apply. And the second question is if the customer is regarded as fit for paying the tax and taking over the tax liability. That is in 13b5. Let's begin with the list of transactions. 13b1, for taxable services which are not tax-free and which are rendered by an entrepreneur from the other parts of the community territory. So the inland, the VAT inland of the other EU states. 13b comes into consideration, and additional conditions which have to be fulfilled are the place of service must be determined according to 3A2, and that's it. So we need three conditions: a service, 3A2, and an entrepreneur from the rest of the community. In our case, the entrepreneur is FE from France. That's correct. We have a service and the place is determined according to 3A2. So 13b1 will apply. Just for the sake of being complete, let's have a look to 13b2. There is also a list of mostly inland cases then, which says working contracts qualified as a delivery and services rendered by entrepreneurs from abroad, deliveries of assets which have been transferred before as a collateral from the transferring person to the new legal owner, certain transactions covered by the real estate transfer tax law, certain construction activities, and so on. Many inland transactions which are suspected by the legislator that fraud might be easy there, and to fight fraud, there we have 13b2, where usually the customer takes over the tax liability. Well, 13b5, I mentioned that is what we need for completion of our case. In the cases mentioned in paragraphs 1, that was our case. Paragraph 1 was fulfilled. The customer is a taxpayer if he is an entrepreneur or a juridical person. Yes, that's the case. So we know everything we need to know for our case solution. 13b1 was fulfilled and 13b5 sentence 1. That makes customer the taxpayer. So taxpayer is M from Mannheim. See paragraph 13b1 plus paragraph 13b5 sentence 1 USTG. The arisal of the tax is then also defined in paragraph 13b1 at the end of the preliminary declaration period during which the service was rendered. So here no date given. Do we have invoicing details? Yes, we have, because paragraph 14a USTG says if somebody does not pay VAT to the fiscal office, that person is not allowed to confirm the reception of VAT contained in the price. So FE is not entitled to confirm VAT on the invoice. The price paid to FE is a net price, and that allows us to say, okay, zero VAT is included in the 7735 which have been paid, because if the taxpayer is the client, is the customer, then the customer has to add the VAT on top. So 7735 was, although it was erroneously paid, the full amount which was paid, and the full amount which was paid can only be in a 13B case a net amount. Then that leads to the consequence that our tax is 7735 times 19%. So 1469. 65 euro, if I computed that correctly. Now, which other problems arise? The French has another invoicing problem. He cannot confirm any VAT. He does not owe any VAT to the German authorities. However, the German law applies, so in principle the invoice should be written according to German law standards, and that would force FE to buy a completely new computer program just for nothing. And so paragraph 14.7 says FE can issue the invoice according to French law of his home country, as long as no VAT is really due there. So the tax identification number, and so that all is done under French law. There is no registration needed in Germany. However, he is still not entitled to confirm any VAT on the invoice. Now, if we go on, however, FE confirmed German VAT on the invoice. That's a wrong invoicing. Under paragraph 14c USDG, FE is liable for paying this tax amount in addition to the correct amount which has to be paid by M. Before we have already, we have still to clear the question if there are declaration duties. And there are. Because if you have such a cross-border service between two entrepreneurs in the EU, then the entrepreneur rendering the service has the duty to declare that amount and the VAT identification number of his customer in the recapitulative statement. Or you could also say it's the regular overview over intra-community transactions in the EU, which has to be handed in an automatic form, into a database of the EU countries where they exchange the information. Good. So that the invoice was a wrong invoice That's number 6, peculiarities, because this is really here a peculiar aspect. However, M cannot claim input tax for the wrongly stated VAT of 1235. Finally, M has paid more than the amount probably agreed to in the contract. 735 net amount instead of intended amount of 6.5. So M could probably demand a correction of the invoice and a refund of the exceeding amount by FE, but as long as this has not yet happened, the situation is legally as described above. So, okay. Input tax claims. M has input tax refund claim for her tax, which she correctly paid for the purchase of this service. See paragraph 15.1 number 4 USDG, and you should really look it up. M has, however, no input tax claim for the wrongly confirmed tax listed in the invoice of FE, because paragraph 15.1 number 1 only allows deduction of the input tax for the amounts which are liable under the law for the deliveries and services claimed for your enterprise, but not for the errors, and that's it, why 14C tax cannot be deducted. Okay, that is, as far as I can see the situation here, the complete solution for our case number 6. So we had a service, the place of service was here, the entrepreneur was from abroad. That doesn't hinder taxability because you have only to be an entrepreneur. Nobody demands that you live in the England. But in that case, later we had with the taxpayer a special rule that the customer takes over the tax liability automatically, and therefore 13b applies. This leads to some interesting consequences, which you have seen here. Thank you for listening to the solution of this case, and I hope it gave you some interesting insights. Thanks and goodbye. Till next time.